March 14, 1945. Remagen, Western Germany. 13:47 hours. The Rhine River Bridge groaned under the weight of American tanks rolling eastward into the heartland of a dying Reich. In a makeshift triage station 3 kilometers from the crossing, beneath canvas tarps stretched tight against the cold drizzle, 23 German nurses huddled together in silence. Their white aprons, once pristine symbols of their medical calling, were now stained brown with mud and dried blood. Some were no older than 19. Others had served since 1939, their eyes carrying the weight of 6 years watching young men die. They sat with their hands folded in their laps, shoulders touching, breathing shallow, waiting. Outside, the rumble of American Shermans grew louder, closer, inevitable. One nurse whispered a prayer. Another stared at the canvas ceiling, her lips moving without sound. They had heard the stories. Every German soldier knew what happened to captured women. The propaganda films had shown them. The radio broadcasts had warned them. Now, in the damp air heavy with the smell of antiseptic and fear, they waited for the Americans to arrive. The war had taught them to expect the worst from men in uniform. By March of 1945, the Wehrmacht's collapse was no longer a rumor, but a visible, undeniable reality. The Ardennes offensive had failed 3 months earlier. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. Anglo-American armies pushed relentlessly from the west. Between these massive forces, millions of German civilians and military personnel found themselves caught in a shrinking pocket of territory, watching their world disintegrate. For women serving in auxiliary roles, nurses, communications operators, clerical staff, the prospect of capture carried a particular terror. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years constructing a narrative of enemy barbarism. Soviet soldiers, they were told, were Asiatic hordes bent on revenge and defilement. American forces, though portrayed as less savage than their Soviet counterparts, were depicted as morally degenerate products of a mongrel society. Their ranks filled with criminals released from prisons to fight, men who respected neither God nor decency. These images had been seared into German consciousness through countless newsreels, radio broadcasts, and whispered stories that grew more horrific with each retelling. The 23 nurses at Remagen had served in field hospitals from Normandy to the Rhineland. They had witnessed firsthand the brutality of total war. They had held down screaming soldiers while surgeons amputated shattered limbs without anesthesia. They had written final letters for boys who would not live to see dawn. They had learned to hide their emotions behind professional masks, to function despite exhaustion and horror. But nothing in their training had prepared them for the moment when they became prisoners themselves. When the German military police abandoned the hospital on March 13th, fleeing eastward ahead of the American advance, the senior nurse, Oberschwester Margarete Köhler, age 38, made a decision. They would remain with the wounded. To flee would mean abandoning 72 German soldiers too injured to move, men with chest wounds and shattered spines, and burns covering half their bodies. So they stayed. And when the American infantry arrived the following morning, the nurses had nowhere to run. The canvas flap opened. The nurses flinched as one, drawing together like schoolgirls facing punishment. An American officer entered, a captain judging by the bars on his collar. He was tall, clean-shaven, his uniform still relatively free of the mud that caked everyone else. Behind him came 3 enlisted men carrying medical bags marked with red crosses. The captain stopped just inside the entrance, removed his helmet, and looked at the assembled women. The nurses waited for the orders, for the rough hands, for the inevitable. Instead, the captain did something that would haunt Margarete Köhler for the rest of her life. He spoke in careful, heavily accented German. "You are safe now. We need your help with the wounded." The words made no sense. Margarete stared at him, unable to process the meaning. Safe. Help. The American captain, whose name tag read Morrison, continued speaking in that same measured tone. He explained that the American Medical Corps was overwhelmed with casualties from the Rhine crossing. German and American wounded lay side by side in the church that had been converted to a forward hospital. They needed experienced nurses. If the German women were willing to continue their work, They would be treated as medical personnel under the Geneva Convention. They would receive the same rations as American nurses. They would not be interrogated. They would not be separated from each other. The captain paused, waiting for his translator, a young corporal who spoke fluent German, to catch up. Then he added something that broke through Margaret's shock. "We have coffee." "Real coffee? When was the last time you had coffee?" It had been 18 months. 18 months since Margaret had tasted actual coffee instead of the bitter acorn substitute that passed for it in Germany's collapsing economy. The specificity of the question, the casual way he asked it, as if they were colleagues rather than captor and captive, it created a cognitive dissonance so profound that one of the younger nurses began to cry. Not from fear, from confusion. This was not how capture was supposed to unfold. There were supposed to be rough hands and cruel laughter and the degradation they had been warned about. Instead, there was an American officer asking about coffee. The historical record shows that this scene at Remagen was not unique. It was, in fact, representative of a pattern that repeated itself thousands of times across Western Europe as American forces advanced into Germany during the final months of the war. United States military doctrine regarding prisoners of war, particularly female prisoners, was explicit and thoroughly disseminated through the ranks. The Geneva Convention of 1929, to which the United States was a signatory, established clear protocols for the treatment of captured medical personnel. But American policy went beyond mere legal compliance. It reflected a fundamental ideological commitment to demonstrating the superiority of democratic values through action rather than propaganda. The U.S. Army's civil affairs and military government training emphasized that German civilians and military personnel would be watching how Americans behaved. Every interaction was an opportunity to prove that American promises of freedom and dignity were not empty rhetoric. Margaret stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She was the ranking nurse, the one who had made the decision to stay. She was responsible for what happened next to the women under her command. She looked at Captain Morrison and asked the question that needed asking. "What guarantees do you offer? How do we know you will keep your word?" The translator conveyed her question. Morrison met her eyes directly and said something in English that the translator rendered as, "You don't know. You'll have to see for yourself. But I give you my word as an officer and a Christian that no harm will come to you or your nurses while you're under my protection." It was the reference to Christianity that decided her, not because she was particularly devout. 6 years of war had complicated her relationship with God, but because it suggested that this American officer operated within a moral framework she could understand. She nodded once, sharply, and turned to address the other nurses. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the terror still churning in her stomach. "We will continue our work. Stay together. Do exactly as they say." Then, to Captain Morrison, in the halting English she had learned in school 2 decades earlier, "We help. We work." What followed over the next 72 hours would fundamentally alter how those 23 German nurses understood the war, their nation, and the propaganda they had been fed for 12 years. The American medical detachment at Remagen consisted of 4 doctors, 12 medics, and 6 U.S. Army nurses who had been working continuously since the bridge crossing began. The facility was desperately understaffed, treating not only American casualties, but also wounded German prisoners and even some German civilians caught in the crossfire. The church that served as the main hospital was a scene of controlled chaos. Men on stretchers covering every inch of floor space, the smell of blood and ether thick in the air, the constant sound of groaning and occasional screams when pain broke through morphine's hold. The German nurses were assigned to work alongside their American counterparts. This, perhaps more than any single factor, destroyed the carefully constructed image of American degeneracy that Nazi propaganda had cultivated. The American nurses were professional, efficient, and exhausted. They worked with grim determination, moving from patient to patient with practiced economy of motion. And they treated the German nurses not as defeated enemies or conquered subjects, but as fellow medical professionals performing a shared duty. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, age 26, from Philadelphia, introduced herself to Margaret, and immediately began coordinating patient assignments. There was no condescension in her manner, no triumph or gloating, just the practical concern of two nurses trying to save lives under impossible conditions. The first real test came within an hour. A young German soldier, no more than 17, was dying of a stomach wound. He was one of the 72 the German nurses had refused to abandon. Margaret was changing his dressing when he began to hemorrhage. Blood soaked through the bandages, pooling on the floor. She called for help, her voice sharp with urgency. Lieutenant Brennan responded immediately, bringing with her a German-speaking medic and a plasma unit, one of those miraculous American plasma units that the Wehrmacht had tried and failed to replicate. Together, the two nurses worked to stabilize the boy. Margaret held pressure on the wound while Brennan established an IV line. The German nurse watched, astonished, as the American expended precious medical supplies on an enemy soldier who would likely die anyway. When the bleeding was finally controlled and the boy's pulse steadied slightly, Brennan looked at Margaret and said, through the translator, "Good work. You kept pressure on the right spot. It was such a small thing." A professional acknowledgement between colleagues. But for Margaret, who had been prepared for brutality and instead received respect, it was profoundly disorienting. She had spent 6 years at war. She had seen what German soldiers did to Russian nurses they captured. She had heard the stories, the things men did when they had power and no accountability. And yet here was an American officer treating her as an equal, trusting her with patience, acknowledging her skill. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. The second transformation came at mealtime. At 1800 hours, one of the American enlisted men announced that dinner was ready. The German nurses expected at best watery soup and black bread, if they were fed at all. Prisoners, they understood, were not a priority when supplies were scarce. Instead, they were led to a section of the church that had been converted into a mess area. American soldiers were already eating, sitting on pews and window ledges, metal trays balanced on their laps. Captain Morrison gestured for the German nurses to form a line. What happened next would become seared into the memory of every woman present. The American mess sergeant, a thick-shouldered man from Texas whose name tape read Garcia, served each German nurse exactly the same meal he was serving the American personnel. White bread, real white bread, soft and fresh. Canned meat, spam, they would learn it was called, though none of them had seen it before. Green beans, canned peaches in heavy syrup. And coffee, real coffee, black and bitter and better than anything they had tasted in years. Sergeant Garcia placed each item on their trays with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he used for everyone else. No shortage, no resentment. When one of the younger German nurses, Schwester Anna Friedel, age 20, hesitated, uncertain if she was really meant to take the food, Garcia said something in English that made the translator smile. The translation: "Ma'am, you're going to need your strength. It's a long shift ahead." Anna began to cry, not quietly, not discreetly, but with great heaving sobs that shook her thin frame. She stood in line holding her tray, tears streaming down her face, unable to explain to the confused American soldiers what was wrong. Margaret understood. Anna was crying because she had not eaten a full meal in 4 months. She was crying because the enemy was feeding her better than her own army had. She was crying because everything she had been told about Americans was revealed in that moment to be a lie. And perhaps most devastating of all, she was crying because she was safe. For the first time in years, she was safe, and the relief of it was overwhelming. The historical documentation of German prisoners' reactions to American food supplies is extensive and remarkably consistent. In memoirs, letters, and post-war interviews, German soldiers and civilians repeatedly expressed shock at the abundance of American rations. The United States military logistical system was the most sophisticated the world had ever seen. By 1945, the U.S. Army could field forces anywhere in the world and keep them supplied with not just ammunition and fuel, but also fresh food, medical supplies, cigarettes, candy, and even Coca-Cola. This was not just about feeding soldiers. It was about demonstrating American industrial might. Every meal served to a German prisoner was a silent argument. This is what a free economy can produce. This is the difference between democracy and dictatorship. For soldiers and civilians of the Reich, who had been on increasingly severe rations since 1943, the contrast was stark. By early 1945, the average German civilian was surviving on approximately 1,400 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life. Meat was a memory. Butter had vanished. Bread was stretched with sawdust and potato flour. Coffee was a fantasy. German soldiers fared only marginally better, and Wehrmacht nurses like Margaret often went hungry so that wounded soldiers could eat. The Nazi regime had promised them that German discipline and will would overcome material disadvantage. They had been told that Americans were soft, their economy rotten with Jewish influence, their soldiers pampered and weak. And then they were captured and given Spam and peaches and real coffee, and the lie collapsed. That first night, the German nurses worked a 12-hour shift alongside the Americans. They changed dressings, administered morphine, held down delirious men while surgeons operated. They did the hard, unglamorous work of keeping broken bodies alive. And throughout it all, the American medical personnel treated them with consistent, almost casual professionalism. There were no leering glances, no suggestive comments, no hands that strayed where they should not. The American medics were exhausted men focused on their work, too tired for anything else. When Margaret needed supplies, she asked the nearest medic, who either provided them or directed her to someone who could. When she had a question about an unfamiliar American procedure, the use of penicillin, which the Germans had not been able to mass-produce, an American doctor took 5 minutes to explain it to her through the translator, speaking to her the way a professor might address a medical student. It was this absence of violation, this persistent ordinariness of professional interaction, that proved most powerful. The German nurses had been braced for horror. They had steeled themselves to endure. Instead, they were being treated with dignity, and that was somehow more destabilizing than cruelty would have been. Cruelty they understood. Cruelty would have confirmed everything they had been told, would have fit into their existing framework of the world. But this respectful collaboration demanded a complete reimagining of everything they thought they knew about Americans, about the war, about which side represented civilization and which represented barbarism. The symbolic power of coffee recurred throughout those first days. The Americans seemed to drink it constantly, in quantities that astonished the Germans. There was always a pot brewing somewhere, always someone refilling a canteen cup, and the Americans shared it freely. On the second day, Lieutenant Brennan brought Margaret a cup without being asked, just set it down beside her while she was redressing a particularly nasty shrapnel wound. "Thought you could use this," Brennan said through the translator. It was such a small gesture, almost thoughtless. But for Margaret, who had grown accustomed to operating in a hierarchy where officers did not concern themselves with the comfort of subordinates, it was revolutionary. The American officer had noticed her fatigue and responded with a small kindness, not as a superior granting a favor to an inferior, but as one nurse looking out for another. The coffee became a symbol for something larger. American abundance, yes, but also a certain casualness about that abundance. The Americans did not hoard or ration or carefully measure. They simply assumed there would be more. This assumption of plenty, this confidence that resources would continue to flow, reflected a worldview entirely foreign to the German nurses. They had spent 6 years in a regime that demanded sacrifice, that glorified suffering, that insisted deprivation built character. The Nazi ideology was fundamentally ascetic, built on the idea that strength came through denial, that hardship forged superior will. And here were the Americans, fighting a war across 2 oceans and a continent, yet still drinking real coffee like it was water, offering it to captured enemies like it meant nothing. By the 3rd day, the initial shock had begun to wear off, replaced by a different kind of disorientation. The German nurses were beginning to notice details about the American operation that their fear had initially obscured. They noticed that American soldiers, even enlisted men, spoke to officers with a directness that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. They noticed that black soldiers and white soldiers served in the same medical units, segregated in other parts of the army. The Germans would learn later, But here, in the desperate chaos of a forward hospital working side by side, they noticed that the Americans maintained discipline without brutality, that orders were given and followed without the constant threat of punishment that characterized the German military. Schwester Helga Zimmermann, age 31, who had served in field hospitals since the invasion of Poland, confided to Margaret on the third night, "They are not soldiers, not like ours, they are something else." Margaret understood what she meant. The Americans did not carry themselves with the rigid bearing of German troops. They were casual, almost sloppy by Wehrmacht standards. They chewed gum constantly. They joked with each other even while performing grim duties. They seemed to lack the sense of martial destiny that had been drilled into German soldiers, and yet they won. Despite their apparent lack of discipline, despite their casual manner, they were winning the war. This, perhaps more than anything else, forced a reckoning with reality. The question that Margaret could not escape was simple and terrible. If the Americans were degenerate, if they were racially inferior, if they lacked the superior German will, why were they standing victorious in Germany while the Wehrmacht collapsed? Nazi ideology offered no satisfying answer to this question. It required its adherents to perform increasingly elaborate mental gymnastics to explain away material reality. The Germans were not losing because they were inferior. They were losing because of Jewish conspiracy, because of treachery, because of numerical odds. But here, in the quiet moments between shifts, watching American medics efficiently triage wounded men, watching American nurses work with calm competence, those explanations felt hollow. On the fourth day, something happened that completed the transformation. A young American soldier, a private first class named Daniel Cooper, died of his wounds despite hours of desperate effort to save him. He was 19, from Iowa, and his chest wound had seemed survivable until he developed a sudden pulmonary embolism that killed him in minutes. Lieutenant Brennan, who had been treating him, was devastated. She sat on the church steps after they covered the body, her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. Margaret, who had just come off shift, saw her there. She hesitated, uncertain of the protocol, uncertain if it was appropriate. Then she sat down beside the American officer and, in her halting English, said, "I am sorry." "You did everything." Brennan looked at her, eyes red, and said something the translator was not present to render into German. But Margaret understood the tone. Grief. Simple human grief for a boy who had died too young, too far from home. In that moment, the last barrier between them dissolved. They were not captor and captive, victor and vanquished. They were two nurses who had lost a patient, sharing the particular sorrow that comes with that failure. Brennan reached over and briefly squeezed Margaret's hand, a gesture of gratitude, of recognition, and Margaret, to her own surprise, squeezed back. That evening, Captain Morrison called Margaret to his makeshift office in the church vestry. She went with trepidation, uncertain what the summons meant. Morrison was sitting at a desk made from a door laid across sawhorses, writing reports by lamplight. He gestured for her to sit, which she did, perched on the edge of a wooden chair. Through the translator, Morrison told her that the German nurses would be transferred to a rear area POW facility within the week. They would continue to work as nurses if they chose, or they could refuse and be treated as regular prisoners. Either way, they would be safe. The Reich was collapsing. The war would be over in weeks. He wanted her to know that whatever happened next, she and her nurses had done good work here. They had saved lives. That mattered. Margaret found herself unable to speak for a moment. Finally, she asked the question that had been building in her mind for 4 days. "Why do you treat us this way? We are your enemies. We have killed your men. Why do you show us kindness?" Morrison considered the question carefully before answering. When he spoke, the translator conveyed his words with particular precision, understanding their weight. "Because you are nurses first, enemy second, and because we believe that how we treat you now will matter after the war is over. Germany will need to rebuild. It will need people who understand that Americans are not monsters, that we keep our promises. We need you to go home and tell the truth about what you saw here." It was a statement of policy. Certainly. Morrison was implementing directives that came from high command, from generals, and ultimately from political leaders in Washington. But it was also deeply personal. Morrison was 29 years old, a surgeon from Massachusetts who had been mobilized in 1942. He had seen enough of war to be tired of it, enough death to hate killing, and he was, consciously or not, engaged in a battle for German minds. Every German prisoner who returned home with stories of American decency was a small victory in the larger war of ideas. The Nazi regime had built its legitimacy on claims of racial superiority and martial destiny. To destroy that legitimacy required not just military defeat, but ideological defeat. Every small kindness, every kept promise, every moment of human dignity extended to a defeated enemy. These were weapons in a war that would continue long after the shooting stopped. The historical record shows that American policy toward German prisoners was not uniformly enlightened. There were abuses, failures, and moments of cruelty. The United States was not perfect in its adherence to the Geneva Convention, but compared to virtually every other combatant power in World War II, American treatment of prisoners was remarkably humane. This was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate strategic choice to use the treatment of POWs as a demonstration of American values. The U.S. military leadership understood that Germany would need to be occupied and eventually rehabilitated. A German population that had been brutalized by occupation would be difficult to govern and susceptible to extremist ideologies. But a German population that had seen American fairness might be more willing to accept democratic reconstruction. On the sixth day, Margaret witnessed something that would become, in her later telling of these events, the defining moment of her captivity. An American chaplain, a captain named Goldstein, identifiably Jewish by name and appearance, came to hold a service for the American dead. Goldstein moved through the makeshift hospital, offering prayers and comfort to the wounded. And then he came to the German section, where the wounded German soldiers lay. Without hesitation, without any change in his gentle demeanor, Chaplain Goldstein began offering the same comfort to the German wounded. He held the hand of a dying Waffen-SS sergeant and recited Psalm 23, first in English, then in halting German. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Margaret watched this with something approaching awe. Here was a Jewish officer of the American Army, offering spiritual comfort to a soldier of the regime that had tried to exterminate his people. The cognitive dissonance was total. Every element of Nazi racial ideology insisted this was impossible. Jews were supposed to be vengeful, cruel, subhuman. They were supposed to embody everything evil and corrupt. And yet here was Rabbi Goldstein, who had every reason to hate, every justification for revenge, offering mercy instead. The SS sergeant, delirious with morphine and dying, accepted the comfort without knowing who provided it. But Margaret knew, and the knowing changed her. In post-war interviews, Margaret Kohler would describe this moment as the death of her belief in National Socialism. She had never been an ardent Nazi. Nursing had been her passion, not politics. But she had accepted the basic premises of the regime. She had believed that Germany was righteous in its struggle, that the Jewish question was complicated, that the Führer represented Germany's last hope for greatness. But watching a Jewish chaplain comfort a dying SS man with gentle dignity destroyed those beliefs beyond reconstruction. If this was what America represented, this capacity for mercy, even toward those who sought your destruction, then perhaps everything she had been told about which side was civilized and which was barbaric was exactly backwards. The transfer to the rear area facility came on the 8th day. The German nurses were loaded onto American trucks. Real trucks, not the horse-drawn carts the Wehrmacht had been reduced to using. They sat on bench seats, watching the German countryside roll past. Everything was destroyed. Villages reduced to rubble, roads cratered by artillery, civilians picking through ruins. This was the Reich they had been told would last 1,000 years, laid waste in 12. As they drove, American supply columns moved the other direction, heading east. An endless stream of trucks and tanks and equipment, a material demonstration of the productive capacity that had defeated them. At the POW facility, a converted factory complex near Koblenz, the German nurses were processed according to strict Geneva Convention protocols. Their names were recorded. They were photographed. They were allowed to write letters home. Censored, but real letters nonetheless. The first communication many of them had been able to send to family in months. They were issued clean clothes, given access to showers with hot water, provided with feminine hygiene products that had been unobtainable in Germany for over a year. These last items, simple sanitary napkins and soap, provoked another round of tears. The German military had not provided such things for its female auxiliaries in years. Women had been expected to manage with rags and improvisation. And here was the American Army, in the middle of an active campaign, with enough logistical surplus to ensure that female prisoners had basic dignity. Schwester Anna Friedel, the young nurse who had cried over the food at Remagen, said to Margaret that night, "How can we go home after this? How can we look our neighbors in the eye and not tell them the truth? That we were wrong, that everything we were told was lies?" It was a question with no easy answer. The Nazi regime had controlled information so completely, had constructed a worldview so totalizing, that to challenge it was to challenge everything. But the evidence was undeniable. They had been captured by the Americans, had been prepared for the worst, and instead had been treated with a dignity they had never experienced from their own military. They had been fed when their own army starved them. They had been respected as professionals when their own officers had dismissed them as auxiliary personnel. They had been shown mercy by those who had every reason to hate. The war ended 5 weeks later. Hitler died in his bunker. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Reich that was supposed to endure for a millennium had lasted exactly 12 years. In the POW facility near Koblenz, the German nurses received the news with complex emotions. Relief that the dying was over, grief for a nation destroyed, and something else, something they struggled to name. It was, perhaps, a grudging recognition that the victors had earned their victory not just through superior material, but through superior values. American soldiers were not supermen. They were farm boys and factory workers, barely trained, often scared. But they came from a society that had taught them certain principles. That all humans possessed fundamental dignity, that mercy was strength rather than weakness, that prosperity came through cooperation rather than domination. And those principles, it turned out, were more powerful than racial ideology or martial mythology. Margareta Kohler was released from American custody in August 1945. She returned to her family's home in Bavaria to find it occupied by displaced persons and her parents dead from starvation the previous winter. She might have become bitter, might have blamed the Americans for the destruction of her country. Instead, she spent the next 40 years working as a nurse in post-war Germany, and then in reunified Germany, telling anyone who would listen about what she had experienced in American captivity. She spoke to schools, to civic groups, to journalists researching the occupation period. Her message was always the same. They treated us like sisters when they could have treated us like enemies. That is what America means. The historical significance of encounters like Margareta's extends far beyond the individual experience. The American decision to treat German prisoners humanely, to provide for their basic needs even when doing so consumed scarce resources, was a calculated investment in post-war reconstruction. Germany would need to be transformed from a totalitarian, militaristic state into a peaceful democracy. That transformation could not be accomplished through force alone. It required convincing millions of Germans that democratic values were superior to the fascist ideology they had embraced. Every German soldier who returned home with stories of American fairness, every German nurse who told of being treated with dignity, every German civilian who received food from American soldiers. These were small acts that accumulated into a massive shift in consciousness. The Marshall Plan, which would rebuild Western Europe beginning in 1948, succeeded in part because the groundwork had been laid by thousands of individual American soldiers who had shown, in small daily interactions, that Americans could be trusted to keep their promises. The economic aid that flowed into Germany was accepted because Germans had learned often through experiences like Margaret's, that American help came without the brutal domination they had experienced under Nazi rule. The democratic institutions that took root in West Germany found purchase because Germans had seen firsthand how those institutions functioned through their interactions with American military governance. The coffee that Captain Morrison had offered, the meals that Sergeant Garcia had served, the professional respect that Lieutenant Brennan had extended, the mercy that Chaplain Goldstein had provided, these were not just acts of individual kindness. They were strategic implementations of a broader policy that recognized something the Nazi regime had never understood: that true power comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the capacity to build, not from domination but from cooperation. The American military in World War II was not perfect. It was a product of its time, carrying its own prejudices and failures. But at its best, it represented a vision of power constrained by principle, of victory tempered by mercy. In her final interview before her death in 1986, Margaret Köhler was asked what she remembered most clearly about those days at Remagen. She thought for a long moment before answering, "The coffee. I remember the coffee. Not because it tasted good, though it did, but because they shared it so freely, as if there would always be more. That's what I learned about America. They believed there would always be more. More food, more supplies, more mercy. And they were right. There was always more. We had been taught to believe in scarcity, in struggle, in domination. They showed us another way. I wish we had understood it sooner. Perhaps millions would have lived." The symbolic resonance of that coffee, dark, bitter, abundant, freely shared, endured in Margaret's memory precisely because it represented everything the Reich had failed to provide: sufficiency, generosity, the casual confidence of a society that produced more than it consumed. Nazi Germany had glorified sacrifice and deprivation, had built its ideology on the premise that strength emerged from scarcity. The United States, by contrast, built its power on abundance. American soldiers could afford to share their coffee with captured enemies because American farms and factories produced enough that no one needed to go without. This was not just economic fact, it was philosophical statement. A free economy, built on individual initiative and protected by democratic institutions, generated wealth that a command economy could never match. The 23 German nurses who were captured at Remagen dispersed after the war. Most returned to nursing in the shattered remnants of Germany, working in hospitals that lacked basic supplies, treating civilians dying from starvation and disease. They rebuilt their lives in a nation that had to confront the full horror of what it had become. Some emigrated, seeking new lives in countries not poisoned by memory. But they carried with them the knowledge of what they had experienced in American captivity. They had been prepared for violation and received respect. They had expected cruelty and encountered professionalism. They had braced for degradation and were offered dignity. These experiences did not erase the crimes of the Reich. They did not absolve Germany of responsibility for the Holocaust, for aggressive war, for the deaths of tens of millions. But they did provide a foundation for reconciliation. When American diplomats spoke of democracy and human rights in the years after the war, Germans like Margaret could say, "Yes, I have seen what these words mean in practice. I was an enemy, and they treated me as a human being." That testimony was more powerful than any propaganda could ever be. The story of the German nurses at Remagen is ultimately a story about the power of lived experience to destroy ideology. The Nazi regime had built its legitimacy on an elaborate mythology about racial hierarchy, martial destiny, and the degeneracy of democratic societies. This mythology could survive military setbacks, economic hardship, even territorial losses. But it could not survive the simple, repeated experience of American soldiers behaving with decency toward captured enemies. Every meal shared, every courtesy extended, every promise kept chipped away at the foundation of Nazi belief. By the time Germany surrendered, millions of Germans had directly experienced American occupation or captivity. Those experiences varied, but overwhelmingly, they contradicted what Nazi propaganda had predicted. The transformation that Margarete Köhler underwent, from a dutiful nurse of the Reich to a post-war advocate for German-American friendship, was replicated millions of times in the rubble of post-war Germany. This transformation was not automatic or easy. Many Germans remained bitter, unable or unwilling to accept that their nation had been in the wrong. But enough changed, enough were convinced by their own experiences, that democratic reconstruction became possible. West Germany became, against all odds and expectations, a stable, prosperous democracy allied with its former enemies. This was one of the greatest political achievements of the 20th century. And it began with small moments like Captain Morrison offering coffee to captured nurses, like Lieutenant Brennan sitting in shared grief with a woman who had been her enemy hours before, like Chaplain Goldstein offering prayers to a dying SS man. In the end, the lesson of Remagen is not about military strategy or logistics, though those mattered. It is about the power of integrity, about demonstrating through action rather than propaganda that democratic values produce better outcomes than fascist alternatives. The United States defeated Nazi Germany through superior production, better technology, and overwhelming force. But it won the peace by treating the defeated with sufficient dignity that they could imagine joining, rather than resisting, the post-war order. This was not softness. It was strategic wisdom of the highest order. Margarete Köhler never forgot the taste of that first cup of real coffee, offered by an enemy who treated her like a sister. It sustained her through 40 years of nursing in a broken nation. It reminded her, in dark moments, that kindness is not weakness, that mercy can be stronger than vengeance, that there are ways to be human even in the midst of inhumanity. She had expected the worst and received something better than she had known to hope for. In that gap between expectation and experience, between fear and safety, a new understanding was born, not just for her, but for a generation of Germans who had to learn, through hard experience, that the propaganda they had been fed for 12 years was poison, and that the truth, however bitter, was also liberating. The canvas tent at Remagen, where it all began, was struck and moved forward with the American advance within days. The church that served as a hospital returned to its sacred function. The wounded healed or died. The armies moved on. But the memory remained, carried by 23 women who had been prepared to endure horror and instead received a glimpse of what a better world might look like. A world built not on domination, but on dignity. Not on scarcity, but on sufficiency. Not on myth, but on the simple, revolutionary idea that all human beings deserve to be treated as human beings, even in the midst of total war. That idea, proven through countless small actions by American soldiers who were just trying to do their jobs with integrity, helped transform Germany from enemy to ally, from wasteland to democracy. It was, in its quiet way, as decisive a victory as any won on the battlefield.